All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the lecture. It's been since Friday where we had a regular a lecture here. A long time. Hope Monday went okay for everyone. No one showed up here at 8 a.m. expecting to have class. Did you really? Oh no. Well, I hope you enjoyed the extra hour, got a coffee or something. We are going to start in with all new, but we're going to start in with the new body system and a new unit today, which is a nice transition. And this is actually great timing. It corresponds with what our lab will be next week, and that is muscles. So today's agenda looks like this. I've got a quick lecture and introduction. Then you've got a super fun learning activity. And notice this, it has like this like party hat next to it. That's like a signifier that it's going to be really fun. So just want to prepare you for that and just make sure you know that when you see that icon, like if someone sends you that in a text message, those are called emojis, and they indicate like certain feelings or ideas without the use of written language. And I've incorporated that here into the lecture in an effort to engage you and signify what's to come. So I hope that's effective. And then we have, we'll continue on talking about the gross anatomy of muscles. So I'm going to just give an introduction about muscles, generally what muscles are, what they do, then we'll engage with that a little bit. And then I'll talk about some specifics muscles in the body and groups of muscles that perform certain actions. Then we'll wrap things up with a ticket out, all very familiar with. Bless you. We need an emoji for ticket. I'm sure there's a ticket emoji. Is there a ticket emoji? I'm totally going to use that next time. You guys be ready. All right. Muscles. Let's talk about muscles. So it comes from the Latin word meaning little mouse, which I think is really strange. Nonetheless, here we are. This the reason for this is thought to be that if you're flexing your muscles, they kind of they vibrate a little bit and it kind of looks like a mouse. I don't see it, but there you go. The muscle is a complex tissue that contains both muscle cells and surrounding connective tissue. And so the muscle as an organ includes different tissue types, including muscle tissue and connective tissue. And all of the different kinds of muscle in your body make up nearly half of your body mass. So a huge amount, very high proportion of your overall mass is muscle. Muscles, of course, perform some very important functions. Talk about those in just a second. I see lots of writing. I'll make sure you got that. You're familiar with the way muscles look under a microscope from our histology lab. And so it's not the actual microscopic structure of muscle I'm not going to cover in the lecture here because you've seen that. But what we will talk about is the general functions of muscle and where we find them in the body. And so muscles do some, perform some important functions in the body. The first is that they produce movement. So this can be through skeletal muscle, moving your bones, which moves your body through space, allows you to do all those great things that you practiced yesterday in lab when we played Simon Says. But also, importantly, muscles can function to move substances through the body or in and out of the body. So a great example of this is the heart, of course, the contractions of which serve as a pump to circulate blood through the body. You have muscles that allow your lungs to expand and contract to move air in and out of your lungs. And so we want to think about muscles moving our body through space, but also moving fluids internally and externally. Muscles also serve to open and close passageways. So for example, blood vessels, when they become dilated, for example, if you are trying to dump off extra heat because you've been exercising, the blood vessels on your associated with your skin will become dilated to increase blood flow and allow you to dump off that heat. In other conditions, they will contract. Another good example is your eye, which muscles there respond to the levels of light and can expand and contract the opening of your eye through which light can pass, the iris. Also, you have muscles that serve as sphincters throughout your digestive system that allow food to pass or not pass through certain areas of your digestive system. So in that sense, they kind of serve as gatekeepers. Gatekeepers of blood, gatekeepers of light, gatekeepers of food, etc. Muscles also serve to not produce movement necessarily, but rather to prevent movement in some cases. So in cases where you have force acting on an object, you don't want that object to move, you need to produce a counterforce so that object stays stationary. And in the case specifically we're going to talk about is maintaining your posture. So I'm, for example, standing here in front of you. I'm not moving, right? Although it's impossible for me to talk and not move my hands. I'm not moving, yet my muscles are working pretty hard to counteract the forces of gravity to keep me in an upright posture. Another good example is when we stabilize joints. We'll talk about that in a little more detail, is that when you move certain parts of your body, other parts of your body need to be stabilized and remain stationary so you can get that leverage. And so that's important, especially around your synovial joints, so those very flexible joints. And finally, muscles are important for heat generation. There is something called shivering thermogenesis, where the contractions of the muscles kind of inefficiently use energy so that the energy doesn't all go towards producing contractile force, but also produces heat. And in certain cases, this can be really important for you. During cold conditions, you're shivering. That's why you're shivering, because that's your body's response to produce this extra heat. Now, muscle heat production isn't always a good thing. In fact, it's generally not a favorable thing. It's a byproduct of exercise. And so a great example is, of course, exercising, running, doing whatever when it's hot outside. Your problem in that case is producing too much heat, not enough, not being too cold, right? And so in that case, that excess heat produced by the muscles is actually something our body needs to deal with in other ways. One of the ways it deals with that is because we are world champion sweaters. Yes. So those are the 4 functions of muscle I want you to know generally. And just pause there, make sure it's clear, see what questions you have. Okay, so properties of muscle tissue. So muscle tissue, this is an issue, this is a topic I really want to emphasize. There's 4 things that muscle tissue does that's unique to muscle tissue and that's important for its function. The first of that is contractility. Muscle tissue has the ability to make itself shorter, and it does so because it contains 2 important myofilaments. So these are muscle fibers in the muscle tissue, and they include actin and myosin. Now, we're not going to get into a level of detail about how muscles contract. Those of you that have taken 251, Human Anatomy and Physiology, we got into depth with that. If you've taken Human Phys with Dr. Panuis, you've talked about that in some detail. We're not going to get into the physiology of it, but it's important to know that the ability of muscles to contract is what's important here, or what an important characteristic of them. Notice that muscles don't expand, they only contract. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a second. The second important property is they are excitable. So they possess the property of excitability, which is kind of a funny way to basically say that they can do what they're told. And specifically here, nerve signals send these electrical impulses and communicate with your muscles and tell them to contract or tell them to expand. And the muscles do, they can respond to those specific electrical impulses. Muscle tissues also possess the property of extensibility, meaning they can be stretched. Notice, importantly here, the verb tense, can be stretched. This is the passive voice, meaning that the muscle tissues are not elongating themselves through their own action, but they're being stretched by other forces acting on them. Generally, muscles acting on the opposite sides of joints. We'll look at that in more detail when we talk about joints. So muscles have the ability to contract themselves, and they have the ability to be stretched for other forces to stretch them. And this is extremely important because if they weren't able to be stretched, they would break, and that's not good. So you can stretch them without breaking. Now, lots of things can stretch without breaking, but then become useless once they're stretched. So a great example is, think about like a piece of taffy or something. You can stretch that taffy or silly putty. You can stretch it really far without it breaking, but then it just becomes like a soggy, long string of taffy. It doesn't bounce back, right? The fourth property of our muscles is elasticity, meaning that they can not only be stretched really far without breaking, like a piece of taffy or silly putty, but once they're stretched far, they bounce back like a rubber band. And that allows them to then be stretched again. And that allows that cycle it allows them to be contract and stretch many times over and over again, which is of course important because we're constantly doing that. So those are the four properties, important properties of muscle that I want you to know. And we'll talk about all of these properties in the context of specific muscles in just a minute. Let me see what questions you have, and then we can move for a super fun learning activity. How many people do we have today? 3, 6, 9, 12, 14. Okay, that works out perfect. We're good? All right, this is what you're going to do. Working in groups, I'll assign groups in just a second. You're gonna have 5 minutes, and what I want you to do is prepare some sort of demonstration that lasts about a minute, between 30 seconds and a minute. I'll say this says exactly 1 minute, but it's fine if it's shorter. And you're going to explain one of these four properties of muscles to the class through some sort of demonstration, skit, song, musical number, however you want to do it with your group. So I'll give you 5 minutes to work and plan. I'll go around, check in with the groups, and then afterwards we'll kind of rotate through and you'll present. So let's do this. Let me go back to this. We've got 14 people in class today, so we'll have a couple groups of 4 and a couple groups of 3, which works out great. So let's do contractility. Let's have Gia, Kylie, Taryn. You're in team contractility. And then we'll have 4 people right here work on excitability. Sound good? Marge, Zoe, Abby, Holly, cool. And then how about 3 in the back? Rand, Drew, Travis, extensibility. And then 4 right here, you guys got elasticity. Sound good? All right, I'll set the timer for 5 minutes. Thank you for bearing with the goofy activity. That's great. Make sure you know those 4 properties. Just give you a visual representation of what those look like. Everyone in the class did a fantastic job. Cool. So just to refresh, we have those 4 special properties of muscles. And I didn't say this explicitly before, but these properties are true for all 3 of the muscle types in your body. That's, of course, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle, as you saw in lab. So I'll just put this up just as a reminder here. One thing to note as well is that excitability is sometimes referred to as irritability or responsiveness. I generally use the term excitable because irritability just reminds me of my kids a little too much. So I'll stick with excitable. Got that? Any questions before we move on? All right, let's talk about some terminology specific to muscle tissue. Whenever you see a word that begins with MYO or MYS, myo or mice, it generally means it's referring to a muscle. So for example, we talked about the protein myosin. That is a muscle fiber that's found in muscle tissue. So just as a little reminder, when you see those prefixes, we're talking about muscle. The word sarco is also used in conjunction with muscle, and this comes from the word for flesh. So 2 good examples here is when you see the word sarcolemma, that simply refers to the plasma membrane of muscle cells. Now, we didn't talk about plasma membranes and the structure of cells in this class. I'm assuming that you've covered that in previous classes, probably in Bio 122 or 120, probably 120, I think, right? That's good. That's, yeah, or other classes. But for whatever reason we talk about muscle cells, that plasma membrane has a special name called the sarcolemma. And the cytoplasm of muscle cells has a special name called sarcoplasm. This is not new information. We know we have 3 types of muscle cells, and all of these are responsible for different kinds of movement in the body: cardiac, skeletal, and smooth. And these different types of muscles are different because they differ in where they're found. So for example, cardiac muscles found in one place in the heart, skeletal muscles found throughout the body in association generally with the bones of your joints and joints in general. And then smooth muscle is found throughout the body as well, generally associated with your digestive system, but also other places as well. For example, just to jog your memory, we talked about in the integumentary system, the little smooth muscles called erector pili that are responsible for raising your hairs on your skin in response to certain conditions or stimuli. The muscles also differ in the way their cells are structured and how they operate. We saw that in our histology lab. And they also differ in kind of the ways that they contract and the kind of forces with which they contract and how often they can contract. And we're not going to get into too much detail here in this anatomy class, but you've probably encountered that in physiology class. So just looking at these types of muscle tissue, this is a bit of a reminder from histology, but I want to make sure we've got this clear in the context of lecture. Cardiac muscle is striated and occurs only in the walls of the heart, and it is, importantly, it's innervated by the involuntary division of the nervous system. Now, we haven't gotten to nervous system yet. I haven't talked about voluntary versus involuntary, but they're pretty self-explanatory. And in this case, you understand that these muscles contract via the involuntary nervous system, which means that you can't consciously control your heartbeat. You can't sit there and think, all right, heart beat faster. All right, heart beat slower. You can do things to instigate your involuntary nervous system to make your heart beat faster. For example, by simply standing up and doing 10 jumping jacks right now, you would make your heart rate go faster indirectly. You can't directly control that. Just to be clear on one term as well, striated refers to these kind of vertical lines here, these stripes that you see in skeletal muscle and in cardiac muscle. And the reason for those bands of muscle has to do with the way the muscle fibers overlap. We don't need to worry about that for this class, but I just want to explain why we see that in skeletal and cardiac muscle. But as you know from lab, smooth muscle is not striated. Smooth muscle, as I just said, is lax striation. It's found in the wall of your hollow organs, and again, is innervated by the involuntary division of the nervous system. So you don't think about your smooth muscle moving food through your digestive system. Kind of thankfully, it'd be a pain if every time you ate, you had to sit there and really think about pushing that food through your stomach, into your intestines, et cetera, et cetera. So this does this on its own in response to various conditions. And that could be in response to you just having eaten food, but also other things. For example, when you vomit, that is the action of the smooth muscle tissue essentially doing reverse peristalsis, and instead of pushing food down through your digestive system, moving it up and out. And that's still controlled involuntarily. Again, you can't consciously control how those muscles react and how they might make you vomit and move the other way. Finally, we have skeletal muscle tissue. This is also striated, and this is in association with skeletal muscles and is voluntary, although there are some exceptions to this voluntary control of your skeletal muscle. A good example is your reflexes. So sometimes muscles can respond to stimuli even before that information reaches your central nervous system. But generally, we can think of skeletal muscles as being under voluntary control. You can think about how you move your arms and your legs, and everything from your facial expression actually is super important for us humans. Our evolutionary history has relied heavily on our ability to on a very detailed level, produce facial expressions that other people can understand and understand facial expressions from other people. That's why it's one of the reasons it's hard to communicate, like when we wear masks and things like that. I'm not saying we shouldn't wear masks for obvious other reasons, but it is very difficult to communicate if you've ever tried to have like conversation with somebody I mean, we all have in the past couple of years, and it can be really challenging because you can't read their facial expression. You don't know what they're thinking. Teaching kind of stinks under that environment. Again, not opposed to wearing masks. I'm just saying that's one of the challenges of wearing masks, is that you can't read students' facial expressions. And so it's hard for me to know if my jokes are really funny or not when I'm teaching. All right, so there's some nice examples of this in your tables and figures in your textbook. You can check that out for more detail. That's all I'm going to talk about right now in class. Go ahead.
So I just have not really. So like, if you get like a muscle cramp, like a calf cramp, what's happening?
So what can happen? That's a great question. So cramps can be caused by a couple of different factors, but basically what's happening is you have this kind of uncontrolled contraction. Basically, all of those muscle fibers are contracting simultaneously, which usually doesn't happen when you're voluntarily controlling those muscles, and they're not releasing. So something is causing those muscles to exhibit their contractility and then not release. And that can be super painful because they're going to kind of continuously be making that muscle shorter in a way that doesn't allow you to then relax. So when you're moving your arms and legs, you're in a natural way, you're contracting, releasing those muscles. But if they're just contracting and the opposing muscles are contracting, it can limit your movement and then also just be painful. And it can be caused by a couple of different things. It can be neurological, but it can also be physiological if certain ions aren't present to facilitate the release of the muscle. It's a good question. Muscle cramps are no fun. Other questions? Cool. We'll talk about facial muscles more. I know I went on a little aside there about facial muscles and facial expressions, but it's really pretty cool thinking about how all of these muscles in our face can produce all of these different expressions that humans can respond to. And we have a lot of muscles in our face that we can control on a really fine level. Yeah.
Is there a reason like our calves and feet cramp like more than other muscles?
That's a good question. Why do they cramp more than other muscles? I don't know for sure, but I'd leverage a guess that just because they're used a lot, and especially they tend to cramp, let's say when you're doing some kind of physical exercise where you're using those muscles a ton. If you were doing some other form of exercise that was super top heavy, but not leg heavy, then my guess is that you'd probably cramp more in those other muscles. Yeah, that's a good question. Cool. All right, let's talk about the skeletal muscle as an organ. And I want to talk about the anatomy of this organ. So I have an example here of somebody doing a curl, talking about biceps. It's kind of the obvious muscle example. It keeps coming up and up and up again. I just modeled this after the great demonstration that we just had. And so what you see here is muscle as an organ. As I mentioned, contains a couple of different tissue types. It includes blood vessels. Your muscle tissue is highly vascularized. It uses a lot of energy to produce these contractile forces. And so you need a lot of oxygen to make that happen. You need a lot of energy substrate like glucose to produce that force as well. So a lot of blood vessels delivering those oxygen nutrients and then removing, of course, carbon dioxide and waste products. We have the muscle tissue itself, and I want to talk about the structure of that muscle tissue. We have the whole muscle. But this whole muscle, if you look at it in cross-section, you see that it's all of these different bundles. And these bundles of muscle fibers are called fascicles. Then each fascicle, in turn, is a bundle of muscle fibers or muscle cells. And so I want to just put this on the board. When we say muscle fiber, that is equal to a muscle cell. Because these muscle cells are kind of really elongated, sometimes they're referred to as fibers. Then within each muscle cell, we see this bundle of these, I'll just call them these elongated proteins called myofibrils. Again, remember this prefix myo refers to muscle. So it's a bundle within a bundle within a bundle. I want to make sure you know that structure. A bundle of myofibrils together we find in a muscle cell or muscle fiber. Then these muscle fibers are bound together to form fascicles, and then the fascicles are all bound together to form muscles. Notice that they're all long and thin and they're all parallel. Now there's some muscle where they're not parallel, but in this example, all of these fibers and all of these fascicles generally run in the same direction. And that allows them, when they contract, to produce all the forces in the same direction. So that gives you a lot of strength to produce force in a single direction. All right, let's look at here. So fun facts about skeletal muscles. We're going to spend the bulk of our time on anatomy moving forward here on skeletal muscles. The anatomy of the cardiac muscle, we'll talk a little bit when we get to the cardiovascular system. Smooth muscle, in all honesty, we don't talk about in great detail in this course. But what we will talk about are the skeletal muscles, where they are, how they interact with each other, and what they do. And as I mentioned, these guys are responsible for, they attach to your skeleton and they pull on it to produce movement. I mentioned muscles altogether make up about half your body weight. And of that, about 80% of it is skeletal muscle. So 40% of your body weight is about skeletal muscle. And each skeletal muscle is an organ, as I mentioned, that contains different tissue types. That includes muscle tissue, but it also includes connective tissue. So that's going to be the sheath that surround the muscle to keep it kind of bound together. Epithelial tissue, so I mentioned there's blood vessels in there, and those blood vessels are made of epithelial tissue, specifically a kind of epithelial tissue called endothelium. That's the creates these blood vessels. And then, of course, all of their muscles are innervated, as our excitability group showed so well. We have these nerves coming in to deliver messages to the muscles and to tell them to contract. Just going to skip ahead for one section and see what I've got. Oh yeah, let's talk about the connective tissue. Okay. So we've got the organ, contains all of these other types of tissues. I want to talk a little more detail about the connective tissue here and just give you a couple more new vocabulary terms. So here is a slide showing a cross-section of muscle fibers. You can see kind of the fascicle outline here. It's this bundle of muscle cells or muscle fibers. Each of those muscle cells you see in cross-section here. And those are bound together by 3 sheaths of connective tissue that basically bind these together and then kind of join up to form a tendon. And these 3 layers are the epimysium. So this is the tissue that surrounds the entire muscle organ, and it's composed of dense, regular connective tissue. So it's really strong and tough. We have perimysium that surrounds each fascicle. So that's inside here, surrounding the fascicle. And then we have endomysium, which is kind of finer connective tissue that surrounds each cell. So we have these kind of bundles and a bundle and a bundle, and each bundle is surrounded by a different type of connective tissue: endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium. I have another slide that I actually think shows this better here coming up. I just want to introduce that terminology. I want you to see what it looks like actually in the muscle. So we have the epimysium surrounding the whole muscle organ. We have the perimysium surrounding the fascicle, and then the endomysium, it's hard to see, but it's surrounding each of those cells. And let's look at that in a diagram form. Actually, this diagram shows it really well. You can see all of those structures in the connective tissue that surrounds them. Notice here, kind of where the muscle attaches to the bone, all of that connective tissue kind of merges and becomes a tendon. And the tendon is what attaches to the bone. So the muscles don't attach directly to bones, rather they attach to bones via tendons. Good so far? Okay. Of course, yep. This slide, I think, is better. I'm going to actually rearrange this slide next time I teach this, but this slide, I think, is better for the definitions, and then the following slide is better for the diagram. Next year, I'll put the definitions with the better diagram. We good? Cool. All right, so we have the diagram here. What's important to note is that when these muscles contract, they operate, they exert that pull via the tendons and via all of this connective tissue. So again, this connective tissue has to be really strong because the connective tissue is experiencing all of the force produced by that muscle. Now, what's important is that the connective tissue also kind of binds everything together and keeps those blood vessels and nerves in line as well. So that, for example, when you contract your muscle, you're not pinching the nerves or the blood vessels and cutting off circulation or cutting off those nerve impulses. So everything has to kind of move and slide together in a coordinated way so that you can produce the force in the direction that you want without disrupting the flow of fluids or signals from the nervous system. I'm going to talk a little bit about tendons here. And I think that's going to be a good way to wrap things up for today. So let me just talk about these tendons. Tendons are connective tissue, right? So going back to histology, one type of tissue is connective. And you're probably familiar with them if you've ever eaten, for example, chicken drumsticks, things like that. And you've got that hard bit on the end of the meat. It's very tough tissue. Here you can see the tendons in the forearm of a human, and then these big, thick white bands, basically. And you can see how they look in the diagram form here, but if you do an actual dissection, they really do look like that. Our forearm, kind of the area just proximal to your wrist, contains a lot of tendons on the front and back, because remember, all of the muscles that control the movement of your fingers are up here in your arm. And so when those muscles contract, the forces travel down those tendons, and each tendon is attached to a different part of your metacarpals or your metacarpals, your phalanges, and to produce these different fine movements. And so because each of these fingers can move independently, you have all of these tendons that run through the wrist. So just remember, going back a little bit to our anatomy of the wrist, we talked about carpal tunnel and how you have this very narrow area where all these tendons and blood vessels and nerves are passing in the wrist. Now you can see all those tendons that go through there. So tendons are generally, as I mentioned, they're composed of this connective tissue, specifically dense, regular connective tissue, and they assist in skeletal movement. And tendons are generally like long and stringy, I'll call them. The same tissue type can also operate as like a big flat sheet, and those are called aponeuroses. And you see an example of that here, aponeuroses attaching the muscles of the back to your spine. And so rather than these individual kind of like string-like structures, here we have a big flat sheet. And you can see aponeuroses here. You have aponeuroses in your muscles associated with your skull as well. So tendons and aponeuroses, both made up of the same tissue type, both essentially functionally do the same thing in attaching muscles to bones. Aponeuroses are just big flat sheets. Tendons are kind of more string-like. Actually, yeah, I'm going to show you one more slide, and then we'll get into muscle movements and attachments on bones on Friday. So each skeletal muscle is served by a nerve, an artery, and one or more veins. So on a microscopic level, each of these individual muscle fibers is associated with, or I shouldn't say muscle fiber. Each individual, essentially, group of muscle fibers are innervated and have a blood supply. And then we have a number of veins that are going to remove waste products and et cetera from those tissues. And you can see what this looks like here. You can see all of these blood vessels surrounding the muscle tissue, which is kind of in pink in the middle there. We'll talk a little bit about how nerves relate in muscles, but basically you have a nerve send a signal, and all of the muscles that are associated with that nerve will kind of contract together. And that allows you to have this kind of coordinated movement. So the takeaway message here, actually looking at the slide, I'm not thrilled with the way I laid this out. The takeaway message here is that nerves and blood vessels are associated with individual groups of these muscle fibers.
People get older,
Mhm.
it's more easier for them to, like pop their veins and stuff like that. Would that affect their muscle capability when they pop their veins when they get older?
You mean like bursting of a blood vessel or something like that? I mean, it sure would, because in that case, you're going to have a buildup of fluid in that area, which is going to restrict movement. And then also it's just going to reduce the capacity to deliver nutrients and remove waste. So yeah, for sure. Varicose veins are a different phenomenon. That is associated with valves in your veins basically not working. I have some slides when we get to the circulatory system, we'll talk about that. But when you see those big, like distended veins, especially in people's legs is most common, that's due to like the blood vessel itself losing its ability to keep pushing blood back up, and the blood just kind of pools, and that's why they get all kind of big and swollen. Good questions. All right, so we'll talk about this gross anatomy and get into all of this fun stuff on almost said Wednesday, Friday this week. Just as a quick reminder, Danny has a tutoring session this Thursday in the library, and I've got just to kick it out for you a couple quick questions about class today. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, try to make it through Thursday, your one day of the week without human anatomy. I know it's tough, but I believe in you. And I'll see you Friday morning.